We are fast approaching the 8th anniversary of the US invasion of Iraq. And as we sit here today, US-backed Iraqi security forces are shooting Iraqi pro-democracy demonstrators in the streets of Iraqi cities. And we have to wonder, how is the US propaganda machine going to explain this one, after they have been telling us for years that we have already bombed Iraq into a democracy? But of course by now, we've all been watching this Orwellian propaganda narrative change constantly every time the reality intervenes and interferes with it. From the very beginning, I saw this war differently, and I think many of us did, as an illegal invasion of another country, a hostile military occupation that then met with fierce and quite effective popular resistance. And unlike the propaganda narrative, we have watched this unfold for 8 years without ever having to change our story. And you can read an account, my book, Blood on Our Hands, of this war, really with a consistent narrative based on what I think is the appropriate context for looking at this war, which is illegal invasion, hostile military occupation, and popular resistance. I can't really summarize the whole book for you in the time we have right now, so I've picked out 5 topics from the book, and I'm going to talk briefly about each one of them. Each one involves war crimes committed by United States officials, but each one also raises questions about how the US propaganda machine, how the US propaganda narrative has served to confuse the public, and thereby to ensure that nobody is held accountable for these crimes, which of course then just permits them to continue. So my first topic is, how did the invasion of Iraq constitute a crime of aggression? The UN Charter prohibits the use of military force except in self-defense or under the explicit authority of the UN Security Council. And under the Nuremberg Principles drafted in 1945, national leaders who violate important international treaties like the UN Charter can be held criminally accountable for their crimes. When they were drafting the Nuremberg Principles in London in 1945, the US representative was US Supreme Court Justice Robert Jackson, who later became the chief prosecutor at the International Tribunal. And what he told that conference was the following. He said, if certain acts in violation of treaties are crimes, they are crimes whether the United States does them or whether Germany does them. And we are not prepared to lay down a rule of criminal conduct against others which we would not be willing to have invoked against us. Now, the crime of aggression was called by the judges at Nuremberg the supreme international crime. And they explained that, saying that the crime of aggression contains within itself the accumulated evil of the whole. Those who start a war of aggression, an aggressive war, are legally and morally responsible for everything that ensues from that. And that was the principle that was applied at Nuremberg. When the US and Britain invaded Iraq in 2003, Elizabeth Wilmshurst, who was the deputy legal advisor to the British Foreign Office, resigned in protest. And her letter of resignation was later published, and in that letter, she called the invasion a crime of aggression. Last year, at the Chilcot Inquiry in London. This is an inquiry into the Iraq War, into how this tragedy happened. Michael Wood testified, and he was the senior legal advisor to the British government at that time. And the inquiry declassified several memos that he wrote in the lead up to the war. There was one memo that he wrote 2 months before we invaded Iraq. And this is what he told Foreign Secretary Jack Straw and Prime Minister Tony Blair. He said, "I hope there is no doubt in anyone's mind that without a further decision of the Council, the UK cannot lawfully use force against Iraq to ensure compliance with its Security Council WMD resolution. To use force without Security Council authority would amount to the crime of aggression." The same term that the other lawyer who resigned used. And so we have not had an inquiry into the Iraq War here in this country. But international law applies equally to the United States and to the UK. So the unanimous and consistent advice of the British legal advisors that the invasion constituted a crime of aggression applies equally to our war criminals, our leaders who dragged us into this dreadful war. My second topic is the 29,000 airstrikes conducted against Iraq in March and April 2003, and the Iraqi death toll throughout the war. The devastation unleashed on Iraq in 2003 was presented to the American public under cover of a propaganda campaign based mainly on mythology surrounding precision weapons. Of course, this goes back a long way. They talked about precision weapons in the Second World War, but of course they weren't very precise, and they're still not as precise as our generals and their partners in the corporate media would have you believe. In the first Gulf War, we all remember seeing bomb site footage of bombs going down chimneys and things like that. What they didn't tell us was that precision weapons at that time only comprised 7% of the bombs and missiles raining down on the people of Iraq. In 2003, the technology had advanced, and by that point, 65% of the weapons being used were classified as precision weapons. However, about 20 to 25% of them still missed their targets by at least 30 feet. So, of the 29,000 bombs raining down on Iraq, about half, 14,500, missed their targets by at least 30 feet. And we are talking about bombs and missiles. The smallest bomb in the United States arsenal is a Mark 82 500-pound bomb. The blast radius of that bomb is between 30 and 300 feet, depending on building construction. So the explosion of one of those bombs in an inhabited area is a horrific nightmare for the people on the ground. And we exploded 29,000 of them in about a 1-month period on Iraq. Now, so then we come to the question of, well, how many people did we actually kill? And again, the propaganda narrative here has been that, well, there are all these different surveys and we don't really know. My book examines 8 different surveys of Iraqi deaths during the war and occupation, and it explains why the surveys conducted by Les Roberts of Columbia University and his international team were really the most reliable. And what they found in their second survey in 2006 was that by their best estimate, about 650,000 people had been killed in Iraq. Another survey was conducted after the US escalation of the war in 2007, which updated that to a figure of at least 1 million. Now, this was, of course, dismissed by George Bush, Tony Blair, and most of the media. However, in 2007, the BBC obtained a memo written by the chief advisor to Britain's Ministry of Defence, in which he called Les Roberts' methods close to best practice and his study design as robust. This package of documents also included memos from worried British officials wondering how they could spin this. But basically, by what British officials privately admitted were credible estimates, at least 1 million people have almost certainly been killed in Iraq. And most of them have been killed not by terrorists, not by car bombs, but by US and US-backed forces in Iraq. However, regardless of who actually killed each of these people, the legal and moral responsibility rests, as I said before, with those who are responsible for the invasion in the first place, for this crime of aggression, because that contains within itself, as the judges at Nuremberg said, the accumulated evil of the whole. So my third topic is, why has US occupation been so brutal for the people of Iraq? So let's start with underlying attitudes. In 1999, on the 50th anniversary of the Geneva Conventions, the International Committee of the Red Cross conducted a worldwide survey of public attitudes towards the protection of civilians in times of war. They found that in other countries, about 75% of the population understood that military forces are not allowed to attack civilians or civilian targets. However, in the United States, they got a different picture. In the United States, only about half the population understands that or agrees with that principle, which is in fact enshrined in the Geneva Conventions. Now, that might be okay if US military recruits received extensive training in the laws of war to compensate for those underlying attitudes. However, that is not the case. US military recruits receive a 1-hour lecture from a JAG officer on the laws of war, and that's usually as far as it goes. And in fact, the ICRC survey found that the attitudes of people who had received military training were about the same as the attitudes of those who had not. Now, to make matters worse, in Iraq, US troops were essentially brainwashed to identify the people of Iraq with the September 11th attacks in the United States. A Zogby poll was conducted among troops in Iraq in February 2006, and it found that 85% of the US troops in Iraq believed that their mission was, quote, to retaliate for Saddam Hussein's role in the 9/11 attacks. I hope you all know that Saddam Hussein had no role in the 9/11 attacks. 77% of them said that the primary purpose of the war was, quote, to stop Saddam Hussein from protecting Al-Qaeda in Iraq. And I hope you also know that Al-Qaeda was not in Iraq until after the US invasion. But the legal responsibility for all of the excessive and indiscriminate violence of the US occupation rests with US military officers who issued illegal rules of engagement and standard operating procedures to their troops. These included dead checking, killing wounded enemy combatants, In some operations, troops were ordered to kill all military-age males. Troops were ordered to use 360-degree rotational fire on busy streets when one of their vehicles ran over and was blown up by a mine. And it was standard operating procedure throughout US combat units in Iraq to call for fire, meaning to call in an airstrike whenever resistance fighters ran into a building or fired from a building. And that included apartment buildings full of people. And then Fallujah and other cities and parts of Iraq were designated weapons-free zones, which meant exactly the same as a free fire zone in Vietnam, meaning anybody could be shot on sight, no questions asked. And then we come to torture. Torture did not just happen at Abu Ghraib. Torture was endemic, widespread, systematic throughout US prisons and detention facilities in Iraq. Human Rights First produced a report called the Command's Responsibility Report. They investigated 98 deaths in US custody over a 5-year period. The report was signed off on by Rear Admiral John Hudson, the retired Judge Advocate General of the United States Navy. And he noted that despite all these deaths, and despite the fact that torture was authorized from the highest levels of the US government, no one above the rank of major was convicted in any of these crimes, and that the heaviest sentence handed down was 5 months in jail, even though torturing someone to death is actually a capital offense under the US War Crimes Act. Now, there was a reason for those light sentences, and the reason is that in every case, the courts determined effectively that the junior ranks being charged were acting under orders from more senior officers. But the courts did not then turn around and charge those senior officers. And Admiral Hudson and Human Rights First concluded that this amounted to a conspiracy among senior officers to guarantee their own impunity. Now, Amnesty International recently called the United States an accountability-free zone. And so I think we can understand that not very much has changed since the coming of the Obama administration in that respect. Now, fourth, the dirty war waged by US-backed Iraqi Interior Ministry forces. Now, US propaganda from the beginning portrayed Iraqis who resisted the illegal invasion and occupation of their country as terrorists. And our media tended to focus on horrific acts of violence against civilians, like car bombs and suicide bombs. But all through the occupation, the US Defense Intelligence Agency published figures which showed that in fact more than 90% of what they classified as enemy-initiated attacks were in fact attacks against military targets, and mainly against US forces. Now, resistance to occupation is by definition a secondary form of violence, while the primary form of violence being committed in Iraq was, of course, the US invasion and the subsequent efforts that really still continue to this day to bring the country under control. US war propaganda led Americans to believe that our forces had stumbled into an ancient sectarian conflict or a civil war in Iraq between Sunni and Shiite Arabs. But nothing could have been farther from the truth. Iraq had never seen violence like this until the US invaded the country. For one thing, there was no ancient rivalry between Sunnis and Shiites in Iraq. The majority of the Arabs in Iraq only converted to Shiism at the end of the 19th century. And in the 20th century, Iraq became a secular society. Many people throughout Iraq intermarried, the Kurds, the Sunnis, the Shiites, they lived together in neighborhoods in the big cities. With the advent of the Iraqi Communist Party in the 1940s and 1950s, many Iraqis were agnostics or atheists. And some of them didn't even know what sect their families had belonged to. So this really just should have been dismissed as a myth, this whole notion of an ancient sectarian rivalry between Sunnis and Shiites. The real source of the horrific violence that swept Iraq in 2005 and 2006 had its origins in September 2004, when the United States, in a corner of the Green Zone in Baghdad, began the recruitment and training of special police commandos for the Iraqi Interior Ministry. These forces were then unleashed on Baghdad in April 2005 and began a reign of terror, abducting, torturing, and murdering tens of thousands of men and boys in Baghdad and elsewhere. In April 2006, an Iraqi human rights group found that 92% of the bodies of execution victims at morgues in Iraq matched the names and descriptions of people who had been abducted by these Interior Ministry forces. Now, there are 3 chapters in my book on what I refer to as the dirty war in Iraq, with more details of the US role in the recruitment, training, command, and control of the Iraqi death squads, and of the individual Americans involved in all of that. They were controlled through a special police command center set up by US military technicians in January 2005 and staffed by American as well as Iraqi personnel. They were trained by special police training teams under the leadership of retired Colonel James Steele, a veteran of the Phoenix campaign in Cambodia and Iran-Contra, and also a former vice president of Enron. When he left Iraq in May 2005, the special police training teams were replaced by special police transition teams. These were US Special Forces, and at least 2 members were assigned to each Iraqi unit and worked with them throughout this campaign of terror in Baghdad. Now, my last topic is the actual US goals and the effect of the war on the people of Iraq. The actual actions of the US government reveal a great deal about their actual goals in Iraq, really tell us more than all the propaganda. People in the US complained that we were spending so much money to rebuild Iraq, but in fact, only 24% of the money budgeted by Congress for reconstruction in Iraq was ever dispersed, and a great deal of that was in fact diverted to the Pentagon and its contractors in the name of security. But the US did spend billions of dollars on construction at its own military bases and at its 104-acre so-called embassy in Baghdad. This is actually 10 times the size of the largest real embassy in the world, the US Embassy in Beijing. And it was clearly not designed as a diplomatic mission to a sovereign country, but as a headquarters from which its State Department staff could manage an Iraqi government that would be independent in name only for many years to come. And in many ways, this civilian component of the occupation was what the war was really all about all along. And so, what is Obama's plan for Iraq? Obama's plan is a so-called civilian surge. One of the first question Hillary Clinton got at her first town hall meeting at the State Department when she took office was, how quickly are we going to be able to reduce the 1,200 member staff at the embassy in Baghdad so that we can rescue the understaffed State Department missions to every other embassy in the world that are understaffed because of this huge deployment in Baghdad. Instead, the Obama administration is doubling that deployment from 1,200 to 2,400. But how these 2,400 people are going to be left if we withdraw all our troops? So the State Department is hiring a force of 7,000 mercenaries, effectively a private army, to protect its 2,400 diplomats in Iraq. And they have already submitted a laundry list of equipment to the US military, of equipment to be left behind by the departing US troops for the State Department's private army. This includes 1,320 armored vehicles, 60 MRAPs, or mine-resistant armored vehicles, 4 fixed-wing planes, and 29 helicopters. But this is really all too late, because the US has not accomplished any of its goals in Iraq. The Maliki government has gained the minimum level of legitimacy with its own people by standing up to its American puppet masters, and the Iraqi National Assembly has refused to pass the law drafted by US officials and collaborators to privatize the Iraqi oil industry. And yet, in pursuit of these goals, the United States has destroyed an entire country. In the beginning of 2007, as the surge began, the United Nations issued a human rights report about conditions in Iraq. They found that 54% of the population was by then living on less than $1 per day. 68% of the population no longer had safe water to drink. 2,000 doctors had been killed. 12,000 more had fled the country. By September 2008, only 15,500 doctors were left, out of an original 34,000. More than half had been lost in the middle of a prolonged national emergency. Altogether, 5 million people have been driven out of their homes in Iraq, about half driven out of the country, and the other half displaced within the country. The UN report also reported that the Central Criminal Court, established by the United States in Baghdad, had sentenced 256 people to death and already executed 85 of them. Hundreds more have been executed since then. And here's the incredible thing. In occupied Iraq, even death penalty trials take between 15 and 30 minutes. In the time I've been standing here talking, in occupied Iraq, you could have been dragged into court, tried, and sentenced to death. That's under US occupation. The UN found that these courts consistently fail to meet minimum fair trial standards, and that, quote, such trials are increasingly leading to the imposition of the death penalty. So, this was the context in which the United States launched its escalation of the war in 2007. Millions of Iraqis had already either been killed or had fled from areas which had been under relentless attack by US forces and Iraqi death squads for 4 years. The sectors of the Iraqi population being murdered, abducted, tortured, and ethnically cleansed were primarily the secular middle class of the country, with Sunni Arabs always a prime target. The violence of the occupation was a full frontal assault on Iraqi civil society that transcended sect and ethnicity. However, the US invasion and occupation probably killed at least 10% of the Sunni Arabs in Iraq and drove about half of them out of their homes. By the standards applied elsewhere in the world, and by its definition in international treaties, the term genocide is an entirely accurate and appropriate description of US actions and policy in Iraq. Thank you.